Hey guys, and welcome to episode 4 of the Grappling Growth podcast. Today's episode isn't like normal. Traditionally, Erald and I will sit down, we'll talk about challenges that are going on in our business, things that we're grappling with, but today is a little bit special. Today, fortunately, we're joined by someone who essentially acts as a mentor for me, Andrew Webber. And Andrew is someone who has essentially been through the mill. He's run an agency, he's closed down an agency, built a new business, which is going to do fantastically well. And we thought it would be fantastic for you guys today to join us, listen to what he has to say. How this episode is going to be run is we're going to have a conversation. It's going to be essentially a round table where the three of us sit down, we share insights, we ask him questions, and you as our audience can essentially... I'll pass it over to you.
And a agency which went to 7 figures and is now running Foundernomics, which Andrew, I'd love to hear more about. I've only heard bits and pieces from Joe, but I'd love to hear about how that journey's been. And as our first guest, we're actually very honored to have someone as prestigious as Andrew, someone that's had the experiences that we're aiming to have, myself and Joe, as people that are on the perhaps the earlier part of that journey and in the same sort of similar space to us as well. But yeah, Andrew, I mean, first of all, seeing as we've yet to meet each other properly, tell me more about yourself, Foundernomics, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, great. And thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to chatting to you both. So Foundernomics was kind of, I guess, born out of the experience I had from starting an agency, growing an agency, ultimately having a very stressful time. Like, we grew fast, lots of headcount, revenue, like we did £1 million in the first couple of years. But ultimately it had a major impact on me in terms of stress level. You kind of go in a little bit with your eyes closed, but and a lot of hope when you start off. And I think some of that was, I maybe wasn't ready for how stressful it was going to be, actually trying to build and maintain a business. I think it's easy to start building, but actually maintaining it is probably the hard bit once you get to a certain level of revenue and certainly overhead. So Foundernomics for me was something that came out of a passion to kind of help other founders. I've had a lot of probably things happen to me alongside the business. When I started to make some big changes to the business, I wanted to change my life, basically, because ultimately, the stress had a really big impact on me and my family life. And I think for me, Foundernomics was about looking back, looking at the things that needed changing, and I have changed, and the impact that's been. And then hopefully I can help shortcut other founders, really, who are hitting maybe some points a couple of years in, 2 or 3 years in, who are, got some sticking points, some stressful kind of moments. Maybe I can help them kind of ease their way through those by looking back on what I did and what I changed, and kind of helping them shortcut some of those problems.
Amazing. And on sort of the trajectory of the agency, because you did £1 million in a couple of years, right? I mean, was this sort of like a hockey stick situation? Was it like, or was it like a very quick, or was it very like a slow rise, and then you hit the 7-figure mark and you're like, wow, we're here?
It was pretty fast. It was pretty fast, really. We doubled. First year we kind of did about 300,000 in revenue.
Nice.
From a standing start. Second year we slightly more than doubled that to get us to about the £1 million mark, and then we kind of hit a period where there was a lot going on in the UK at the time. So there was 2 elections in a short period of time, over a couple of months period. Then there was Brexit kind of actually came in after a kind of a long period after the vote. So the markets were a bit unsteady anyway, and people, a lot of brands were looking at, were they going to keep hold of their money for the time being? And I think people got a bit jittery. So at that point, we went down from 10 people down to 7 at that point, and we kind of felt we got ourselves in a good position to be a more profitable, sustainably growing business, because it was a fast rise. And I think one of the things that people don't realise is that it's actually when you're growing fast rather than growing a bit slower that you can get yourself in trouble, because your overheads dramatically go up. And if your pipeline isn't stable or things start to fall out of your pipeline, you can get caught with your pants down really fast. And I think that's something that I sort of started to realise when the markets were a little bit jittery. So we kind of cut down a bit and sat there thinking to ourselves in February 2020 that we were going to be a much more profitable business. And then obviously 3 weeks later, COVID happened. So, it was already, I think people maybe don't talk about this much, but the environment from a kind of budget point of view, from a marketing point of view, was already a bit on a downward trajectory before COVID came in.
Yeah.
When the pandemic happened, obviously everyone just stopped what they're doing. We had a lot of retail clients, Joe Malone, Pret a Manger, people like that. They shut their shops. So, when it comes to analysing shop data, well, there wasn't any. So they stopped pretty quickly. So we were lucky we had some healthcare clients as well, and that picked up and that got us through really. But yeah, it was a fast rise. And I think that's probably my first big lesson, is that when you're rising fast, in terms of revenue, sometimes it's better to hold your horses a bit when it comes to increasing overheads and kind of chasing that revenue. I think that's an ideal time to sit down, and rather than just blindly saying yes to revenue, is actually look at the revenue that's coming in, and maybe you start to think about not growing so quickly from revenue point of view, but maybe you can replace some of the older revenue that maybe is less profitable or has a higher cost to serve attached to it. You can start to replace some of that revenue so that you are growing, but actually your overheads don't need to sort of rapidly ramp up as well. Because, I remember sitting there we did a record month in November. We did £67,000 revenue. So this was probably when we were getting to like the peak of our kind of growth point. And we didn't make a profit. And I did think to myself at that point, I think I'm doing something wrong here. And unfortunately, loads of things suddenly went wrong, kind of December, January, February, March into COVID. And like, it was, that was a major learning curve there, was to not overcommit from an overhead point of view, because you just assume growth is just going to keep happening.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point as well. And the thing is, like, for me and Joe, because we've gone through, and Joe, I'd love you to give your input here as well, because our agencies have really grown. We grew through COVID, so we had very different market conditions. And I remember when I hit the 6-figure mark during COVID, and the markets were so unstable, I was like, am I in this sort of like weird bubble where I've just hit a very sweet spot with my clients, and actually at any point this could fall away? Or was it that like I can still grow sustainably through incredibly tough market conditions? And I don't think it was. I think I was personally quite lucky with the clients I had. But as you said, Andrew, a lot of businesses out there had clients which were immeasurably impacted by the pandemic, and a lot of agencies in the space I knew did drop their headcounts. And I was sitting at like a 6 or 7 like full-time staff, and yeah, I realized like, damn, this is not profitable at all. Joe, I think you maybe had something similar going on too.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the big benefit of being smaller, is that you can be way more agile. You can pivot as quickly as possible. We've been able to build new agencies, so to speak, within 2 weeks. If we want to target a new market, we can go to market really quickly and test that. And I think I've always thought of what the advantages that you can play with. And this was from a business coach from years ago. He mentioned that if you are a one-man agency who's based in your mum's loft, then focus on that as a point. Equally, if you're, say, like Andrew, where you've got a team, you've got an office in London, equally within your sales pitch, within your messaging, you want to focus and you want to harp on about that. And I think agencies do it pretty well nowadays, where they use Instagram, they do a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, iterate and work on the fact they've got a team. I think I benefited massively because I was so well positioned to work in different markets. And when COVID hit, I looked and I assessed, and this was before AI and ChatGPT was what it is today, is I thought, where are going to be the quickest the lowest hanging fruits per se. So we moved into the FX space, and then we moved into the e-com space, and we tested both side by side. And it was fantastic because it gave us an opportunity to essentially split test, and then we just ran on with a market segment which made best sense to us. And I really believe that if I had the bigger team at that point, then that would have been far harder to achieve. And equally, I remember sitting down in July 2021 and the start of 2022, but July 2021, and I could just see the bank balance increase and what we were doing month on month and quarter on quarter. And I just thought I cracked the code to business, but little was I aware that a lot of the time things are trends. And as you get older, you live through market cycles, you can see new positions. It was a really good learning curve because it's never let me take things for granted since. So that was kind of my adjacent perspective on that. Andrew, I've got a question for you. And we spoke about the region beats paradox before. And for those who don't know what the region beats paradox is, it essentially assumes that if you want to go a mile or less, you walk. If you want to go further than that, then you take transportation. So an example of this would be if your relationship isn't that good, but it's bearable, then you stick in it. But there's a moment in time where it gets so bad that you leave that relationship. Or business isn't great for this instance, which we're going to get onto. And it's not too bad. You know, people aren't doing their job as well as you want them to be doing it. However, there's something that happens where maybe you lose a really, really important client and that's it. Andrew, was there a moment within your business, because I felt this at times, whenever I make that pivot or change, did you have that region beta paradox moment within your business?
Yeah, I mean, there was a few occasions that I had that were kind of, I guess, what you'd call trigger moments, really, that made me kind of forced me to look at what I was doing. Truthfully, a lot of them, and this really is actually another big reason for the kind of why I moved much more into like the Foundernomics side of things, is that a lot of them were things that I came to realize about my own life and the fact that the business had taken over ultimately, and because it was stressful, I was so focused on that all the time that the stress had kind of engulfed me a little bit, and I'd stopped putting myself first. I'd stopped making time for things that were important to me, like, you know, I always left work and stopped working at like 4 o'clock so I could be there for my eldest daughter when she was first born. We've got 2 now, but like, that was always really important to me, to be there for them. But ultimately, like, you do find yourself not being present even when you are physically present, because you're so stressed all the time about all these millions of things, whether it be overheads or sales or the pipeline or a lead that might have just come through, or you've just done a proposal or something and you're kind of waiting to hear for weeks on end and you don't know whether you should chase it or not, and all these things that kind of load up ultimately. But I think most things that happened were moments that I had to come to a realization myself, I think, really. And a lot of it was, you know, I had a really good team. I had some great people. And I probably, looking back on it, I probably held on for too long just because they were great and I really enjoyed working with them, but also they were really good at their jobs. And I felt that we'd finally got into a position where we probably had the best team we ever had. So to kind of call it quits at that point the reason for that was really that I could see the economy was not really recovering fast enough. People were holding on their budgets again. You know, people started to think about recessions, and I just got to this realization that we used to get something signed off in a couple of weeks, and it was taking 3 months, really. So what we were really seeing was that, you know, what would have been a quarter's worth of pipeline was actually turning into 2 or 3 quarters worth of pipeline. So that money was coming in, but so slowly that it was getting stretched over a much longer period of time. And I think the big realization for me was I went on holiday and I kind of said, right, I very rarely did this. And I was quite burnt out, and I went on holiday with my family, and I said to myself before I left that I think there were 5 things that were kind of either in the pipeline or we were waiting for sign off on, or a couple of those types of things. And I said to myself, right, I had a really good team. I didn't need to do any work. I was away for a week, and I just said, right, I'm just going to see what happens with these. I'm not going to chase anything. I'll see what happens. And we literally landed, and I got an email as we landed from one of the bigger things falling out of the pipeline. And I just thought, okay, well, all the signs are telling me that this is not a viable kind of multi-person business at the moment. I wouldn't say never again, because I worked in a lot of big agencies before, and I think that kind of gave me my view of what a successful agency would look like, from a kind of atmosphere and from a people point of view. I only ever saw inside of the P&L of my own area of the business. I never really saw the bigger business P&L, so I don't know how successful they were, from that point of view, and how stressful people found it. But maybe when you've got a leadership of 10 people, it's not as stressful. When it's the leadership of one person, it obviously is a lot of weight to carry. But I guess the big thing for me was I had a growing realization in my mind, that this doesn't feel like it's sustainable like this anymore. And then multiple things fell out that week that I was expecting, that would continue to make it viable. And I think ultimately, my energy level would run out at that point when you've been running hard for 5 years, not sleeping. My eldest daughter was a really bad sleeper as well. So we weren't getting much rest, constantly stressed. You realise, actually, I think you have a moment where you think, I don't actually enjoy this. So that was a big moment. Truthfully, I probably knew it for a long time, but just admitting it to myself was a big thing, really. So I think there were business things that were happening, Joe, that kind of were trigger points, but there were many trigger points that I ignored because I wasn't willing to kind of admit defeat, probably a little bit, or, you feel like I think there's this thing where people assume that they would feel like a failure if that happens, but actually it felt like a win. It felt like I can stop doing what I've kind of been doing for so long, and I can completely remodel it into something that works for me now. And that was a really freeing thing to understand. It took me a long while to understand, but yeah, there were multiple triggers that I ignored, to be honest, Joe. Just to go back to your previous point, actually, though, Joe, I think your business has always been very good at setting up processes, and you're quite good at the kind of mechanics of delivery and bringing leads in and then delivering pieces of work for clients. I think the difference between your type of agency is that it is quite process driven and quite process heavy. So effectively, you were able to lift and shift it to another market quite simply because you knew you had processes in place to do that. What is interesting from a kind of a less process-driven agency, of which many creative agencies and brand agencies and even digital agencies, which should be more process-driven but often aren't. We're a data business, right? We should have been process-driven, but we were often very bespoke to every client, and that's not a great way to build a profitable business, by the way. It also means that if you're making everything up as you go along, the thought of moving to a different market or a different target audience, or even upscaling what you're doing to a different audience that can pay much more money, for example, that is a really big kind of thought to undertake, and it feels almost impossible to kind of start that. Whereas I think with you, Joe, your business is very good at kind of going, this works, we'll test this other thing, and you can just roll it out to something else because you've got a lot of systematic things in place. And I think that was a big learning for me as well, is that if you're always starting from scratch, it's hard enough starting from scratch with a client, let alone starting from scratch again with a whole business. You need to document the things that are kind of underpinning everything. And I think that's a big thing for me now is, be agile, but you can be agile by putting process and rules in place. There's no way of being agile if you're making it up as you go along.
And I think, to your point, and I appreciate the kind words, I only got to that point because I saw that anytime we weren't successful with a client, or not any time, but quite often the times we weren't successful with clients is when they try to set the rules. And I had to be very forthright when a new client came in to say, okay, no, we're going to use Slack and we use Google Drive here and we use ABC processes and this is how you add us to your ad account and this is how it works. And you'd have a few people who'd push back and say, oh no, can you join us on Teams, or can we use this? And they would start throwing stuff in different directions, and that doesn't work. And even within our own team, we would set just non-negotiables. And any time someone would come into the team, I would have them read the Black Book. And I got this concept from, I can't remember who it was, but it was a high performance podcast. Former England rugby coach, 2003 World Cup. If any of you guys know it, then that might be helpful. And he mentioned the Black Book. Who was it?
Clive Woodward.
That's it. So Clive Woodward. And I remember listening to that, and I remember so specifically when it was. It was November 2020. And it was a Sunday evening. I was out playing football, came back, and I just went crazy on this Black Book. Next day, went through it and just kept on iterating it. And with this, and I've always done this amongst our team to see how well they're keeping up with what we're doing, is I would drop what they mentioned on the High Performance podcast as blue M&Ms. So if anyone doesn't know the story, the blue M&Ms, there was a band that used to tour back in the 1980s. They would turn around and they would have a 4-page contract or whatever. And on the third page, on the 27th line, they would say, just to confirm you've read this, make sure you remove blue M&Ms from the jar of M&Ms that we have here. And they would know, they would see how much attention to detail people would be putting into what they're doing. So I encouraged the team, I did this over and over again with myself, is I would drop these blue M&Ms because that would show me that people are actually using the process. So an example might be, we might record a video and then on the last sentence of the video, so this might be in the last 3 seconds, say, just to confirm you've watched this video, reply back to me with your favorite animal emoji. And it's something so simple, but that showed me who was serious. That showed me the people who actually paid attention. And I think I tried to really etch that twofold with clients and then also with the team.
Yeah, I think the team's such a big part of. It's a real tension, right? Because ultimately, the team are. I personally have come to believe that they're your biggest investment, not just from a P&L point of view, because they will be the biggest cost on the P&L, right? But they're also the biggest investment to your stress level, because there's managing the team, but there's also the fact that for every pound that you're spending of your budget on somebody else, that is more money you need to make sure is coming in, and it also is money that you're going to worry about. So if your overheads are $5,000, well, you're going to worry a lot more when your overheads are $10,000. Like when my overheads were 60 odd grand, you know, that was a constant worry for me. Now I had some great people there, but actually, like that investment is kind of is much more than the money on the page. It's such a you're making an investment in, like, you're willing to, you know, to increase your stress level. That's what it is. You're also making a down payment on, like, increased stress. So the reality is that you got to make sure that the ROI that you're getting back from that kind of investment financially is also worth the increased stress that you're going to get as well. So, like, this is something that has become a big thing for me now, is that everyone looks at the black and white on a spreadsheet of what, like, costs are and profit is and success looks like for them, but they're never really looking at the intangible stuff around it, such as stress, for example. So, you know, running a 12-person business that's doing £1 million in 2 years but wasn't really making any profit, that's much more stressful than running a 1-person or a 2-person business that's doing 60, 70 grand in profit a year. And you haven't actually got to worry about a lot of stuff. Like, you don't need a big office, right? You don't need to have an HR platform. You don't need to have something that tracks holiday. You don't need to, like, make sure you've got processes in place for, you know, things like maternity leave, which that was a really great moment for me, was when a good friend of mine who I'd worked with for a long time, she was going off to have her first child, and we didn't have a maternity thing, so I got to create one. And I thought to myself, what's the point of having a business if you can't create something that makes somebody's life better who you care about, right? So, like, that was a big, like, plus for me to be able to do that. It cost the business more money than, you know, technically it needed to, but that was a good investment for me, because not just to keep her happy as an employee, but that's why that's what having a business is about, doing things for people that you want to do things for. So, but again, like, it is really important to kind of look at what you think success is. For me, too many people go into it thinking only about the numbers. Like a happy, successful life is not the one with the biggest number coming in at the end of the month, because that also means there's probably a much bigger number going out as well. So, managing that is tough. And that's why I've remodeled the business ultimately to be, I've got a couple of different things. I still do some data consultancy and data work. I have a couple of people that I work with on that. But yeah, it's significantly more flexible. And I think that's had the biggest impact, is that when times are quiet, you're not sitting there stressing out the whole time. I just think, well, this is an opportunity to have a break then, if it's quiet.
I like that. So, Andrew, I know what you've been essentially going through with the new business recently, how you're repositioning your offerings and what you do. And what you're looking to optimize for in life now is to make more money while working less. And I think ideally that's what a lot of us want. And I speak to my brother, who's just turned 21, and I speak to other people. And I remember myself when I was in first year of uni, I remember telling my mum, we had a bit of a spat, and I said, oh, it's fine, I'm going to move out of here and I'm going to become an investment banker. That was the goal for me as a teenager. And I don't care about working 18-hour days. And soon you realize, you could do that for maybe 2-3 months, but soon you realize, well, actually, what actually matters. And I think optimizing for happiness, in my opinion, overall should be the number one goal. And as you mentioned, there's a cost to everything in life. If we want to enjoy ourselves more, well, we're probably going to sacrifice a little bit more financially. And if we want to make more financially, then we probably have to sacrifice a little bit when it comes down to time. But we're trying to find that balance. Erald, we've got a question that we essentially come up with for Andrew, and I think this works really well with the Foundernomics angle and what you're doing there. So, Erald, do you want to shoot?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I jump into the question, Andrew, I've got to say, I think you raised some really good points there about higher revenue and the stress that comes along with it. I think there's a famous quote that said, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And if you have 100K, if you see a lot of gurus out there with 7-figure businesses, but losses on their P&Ls, then, it is complete vanity at the end of the day.
Just before you, another vanity metric I think that goes along with that is head count.
Yeah.
You see a lot of people talking about, oh, we've got 20 people now. And I think, well, I could employ 20 people now. I probably wouldn't have to pay them. But that doesn't mean anything. Headcount doesn't mean anything. Ultimately, I think it's another vanity metric that people use. And they do use revenue. Like, I can sit here and say £1 million in a couple of years or whatever. But we didn't make any money. So, what was the point?
Yeah.
I paid a lot of tax. I'm happy to pay my tax. I believe in people should be paying their tax. And I paid a lot of people wages that was good for their rent and it was good for their mortgages and stuff like that. And I'm happy about that as well. I wish I had a bit more, but so revenue, headcount, these things, they don't mean anything ultimately.
Absolutely. And founders eat first, as you've said. So,
Exactly.
that's the key that I think we're trying to push here, which is kind of related to the question. This was actually something that was put forward to me by someone I knew quite a bit ago, but I think it's actually quite related to what you just said, Joe, and what you're all about, Andrew. So I've spent the last 2 years trying to build a business in the e-com space. I left banking about 4 years ago, after around 4 in the industry, and I've been working odd jobs in the fintech space, but I wanted to give it a go at building an online business, as many are. However, it's been killing me. Banking was killing me, but at least it paid well. At this point, I'm stuck and I don't know what to do. The e-com space is not moving, I'm not making any money, and I'm not sure where to go next. At what point do I stop killing myself doing something I love when I'm not able to sustain it?
So you should always stop trying to kill yourself, no matter if even if you're doing something you do love. The reality is that people have kind of got a bad thing in their minds now about money as well. I think the reality is, right, you can optimize towards happiness, but you know what does make you happy is having enough money. Constantly chasing more money for no discernible reason is where it won't make any difference. But having enough money to put food on the table and pay your rent, like that is a necessity, right? And I do believe as well that there's a lot of a narrative out there at the moment around, you should always follow your passion and all like that. I actually don't really agree with that a lot of the time, because a lot of the time your passion doesn't pay the rent. So, there's no point in blindly following your passion and dream if you can't put food on the table, because you know what? 3 or 4 years, 5 years, 6 years of putting food on the table, right? And I've spoken to actors, spoken to writers, like lots of people in this area that, make under 10 grand a year and they're like 30 years old, right? It's not, at what point, and Joe, we've talked a lot about compound interest, for example, right? If you're not starting to do these things, so you're 40 years old, like you haven't got long, like, to have enough money to make you comfortable. So the first thing I would say is, if your friend went into the e-com space, why do they go into the e-com space? Because they love it, or because they want to get out of banking? Like, I think, don't get me wrong, like banking is extremely stressful. Like the, illness, if you look at the illness numbers, heart disease, lots of things like that, they're sky high in that industry. And there's a reason for that. It's because no rest, long hours, you don't get enough sleep, and your diet is terrible because of all those things, right? So it's very unhealthy for a lot of people, and that's why mental health is a real problem in that area. But I think my personal view is that you've only got so many hours in the day, so ultimately my suggestion would be to try and find, if he believes that there is growth in the e-com space, and this is another thing that people need to realize, like it takes work to set something up. You can't just start something and then a couple of months later kind of think, oh, this is not working. You need to commit. And I think where people kind of make a mistake is they try to commit to doing 2 jobs when it's going to take a year. You can't do 2 jobs for a year. Like that's not sustainable. How I started to look at doing it, 5, 6 years ago, was that I'd start looking at, and in fact I was doing this 10 years ago as well, like cutting down to 4 days, cutting down to 3 days, while you're giving yourself time to build something else. But it's also you need to remember that time's there to recuperate and I don't know, listen to podcasts, watch TV. Like those things aren't the enemy. Like you need to switch off. And my concern for your friend there is that it takes a really long time to build a business up. Certainly to get to anything kind of financially that he might be accustomed to from a banking point of view. He needs to kind of make a realization that ultimately those 2 things aren't the same. Like he needs to divorce his mind from the money there and just look at what does he need, and if he's willing to commit to getting that from e-com and, like you say, doing odd jobs or whatever, but he can't do that at the same time as a full-time career. That's not even a 9 to 5 career. That's Joe, to your point, that's like an 8 till 10 career. Like when does he have time to sleep? So I think some careers are not conducive to having a side hustle, and they pay you for that.
Absolutely.
So it feels like he needs to probably go into something else. That would be my first piece of advice. Come out of banking, go into something else where you can pay your bills, but it gives you more time. So you're not working till 10 o'clock at night, like 6 days a week. It gives you a few hours to start building things up. And that would be where the kind of time needs to come from, because that's the dominant thing for his time, really. So if he doesn't ever do that, then he's never going to get out of banking, would be my kind of slightly blunt advice, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great shout. I mean, just a bit of personal context as well. The person, he's been doing banking at large financial institution, and then went into startups in the fintech space, which still can pay well if they're well funded, but generally, again, high speed growth, not very stable at all.
Long hours.
Absolutely.
I think that's the thing for me. He needs some hours for himself to work on his business. So he needs to pick something, and this might be tough ego wise, right? Because sometimes you need to kind of go, well, actually, do you know what? I'm going to go and do something completely different that people would look at and think that's a sideways or a backward step. But you do need to do that, because otherwise, people would look at, I closed the agency down. That felt like a big backward step, but it's released me to move forward in 2 or 3 different business areas very quickly. So like banking. Like, there's a quick way to get out of banking, and that's like get out of banking. Like
Yeah.
that's what he needs to do, really. There.
Absolutely. And I think it's all about like runway as well. I think if you're thinking about leaving your industry to do something which you don't know if it's going to pay you, unless you have like even 6 months might be light,
Yeah,
like
6
a
months.
year's worth of, you know,
Yeah, 6
expenses
months
in the
minimum.
bank. Yeah, 6 months probably be like the sort of like a minimum viable product in terms of trying something to see if it actually gets traction. But, you know, when it gets to the 6 month mark and you're like, fuck, I don't know if I can make rent, you might have to go. You might have to go back into a job or back into the industry.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, but
and that's okay. Like, I think the runway needs to include, you know, it almost needs to be like, how can I sustainably pay my rent whilst working on this? And that might mean that you need a part-time job, or you need, you know, I think that's not something that's not talked about enough, which is, you know, you need to build on the side until you've got enough money to go for it properly. And I think 6 months, as you say, is probably not long enough, because after 4 months, you're looking at the numbers and thinking, and with deal cycles and all these sorts of things, you know, you're starting to look at it and think 6 months is too early to be taking money out of your business, probably.
Yeah.
That
it might actually kill you.
Reinvested.
Yeah, it might kill you early, actually. If you're like, you see traction month 4, but you're like, I don't have enough actually to cover myself even by month 6 if we continue at this rate, then you're killing yourself before you've even started.
Exactly. That money needs to be reinvested into the business, not just come out so that you can pay for rent.
Yeah, 100%.
You both pose very interesting perspectives on that, and I think and we've all done this where we're in a job and we've quit, and Erald, I think you know this, but when I quit my job back in 2019, I had £200 retainers coming in, and I had a moment where, walking past the girl in the corridor, asked her how a Tuesday's been, and she just said, "When's a Tuesday ever good?" And that was the nail in the coffin, plus something quite personal where my boss kind of put a middle finger up to me per se, and that was it. And I think I agree, if I could go back in time, which hindsight bias, right, I would have left with more money in the bank and more guaranteed money. But I think a friend said to me, he said, if you want to make sure you're working hard, just take out a credit card and max it out. And I think metaphorically, that's what I did. I knew I had to work hard, and I gave myself mentally 6 months. And luckily, my expenses were far lower than maybe someone who has children, because I was just living at my parents'. And I think the way how I look at risk is based on age. So the younger you are, the more you can kind of turn around and say, well, screw run rate, I can turn around and I can do this within 3 months. If you're living at home and you're not paying your parents' rent, I was paying my parents' rent, albeit not as much as I would be if I was renting privately, then I think risk it. And it's kind of what Warren Buffett says about risk. He says you want to look at how much of your portfolio is exposed. And as you get older, you take off less percentage. So if you're 20 years old, 80% of your portfolio should be in risky assets. As you get older, when you hit 50, it should only be 50%. And I think that's personally how I would view it as this person. And ultimately, he's risked a lot by going from banking to fintech to e-com. And one thing that I've realized as I've been growing my business and had to look at new markets is not all markets are the same and have the same opportunities.
I'd also say, like, I don't think e-com is niche enough. He really needs to get down to, like, to use an example, like, you know, sports e-com, like whatever. He needs to drill right down into one niche, work out how to make that work, and then expand or go to an adjacent niche or something like that. But like, the only real way to do it, you can't just, you know, it's like starting a marketing agency and being like, we're a marketing agency. Okay, well, you know, what does that mean? Who's the audience? What problem are you fixing? Like, he needs to almost kind of pick a lane, and a small one. And that's why a lot of people end up doing it for small businesses to start with, right? But I think you need to pick a lane, pick a niche, you know, go really deep on it, and basically just make sure you can make that work. And, you know, there's even a small niche, there's loads and loads and loads of budget there. Like, I think people are scared to kind of, you know, niche right down, but it just makes the whole thing much easier.
And it's exactly what Jeff Bezos did with Amazon. He started in books. Once he kind of conquered books, and he was essentially a book broker. He wasn't even a bookstore. He then looked at adjacent markets such as CD players, videos, whatever was popping back in the 90s.
I remember that. I remember what was popping back in the 90s, Joe.
I don't.
Like, a long time before, yeah, you wouldn't have, but yeah, because DVDs, he went into DVDs at that point because it was similar, basically. But the reality is that the niche can be anything. You know, I saw someone that was like doing lead generation for dentists, and they were absolutely killing it, and that's because like no one does that. But you know what? There's a lot of dentists that need people to come through. Like, it doesn't have to be some kind of, purpose-driven D2C brands. It doesn't need to be something that's very generic and very kind of the moment. It can just be something that works. Like, that's what he needs, something that works.
Simplicity scales, as we say.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Lovely.
Well, brilliant. Thank you for that breakdown, Andrew. I thought that was a great response to that question. If anyone does have their own opinion on Andrew's opinion or the opinions of ourselves or any advice for this person that's sent the question in, then please do let us know. Before we close off, and I'm hoping that everyone's enjoyed listening to Andrew. The only negative I can say about Andrew is that he does support Tottenham, so please do send any abuse his way about that.
But it's a self-abusing thing anyway, so I wouldn't,
Fair enough. Don't heap. Don't lump on. But yeah, Andrew, before we sort of close off, I'd love to. Is there anything that you want to tell the audience either about Foundernomics or about yourself? I mean, obviously, do check him out. Do follow him on all the social medias. Is there anything that you want to say directly to our audience?
I guess I've just finished a video series, like a free video series that you can get access to if you go onto the Foundernomics site, which is founder-nomics.com. It's basically my 9 golden rules for working less and making more. So there's lots of stuff in there around profitability, niching down, how to build a profile better, how to kind of just make sure you're putting yourself first, actually, as a founder. So they're all things that I wish I'd known when I was kind of working through it myself. There's a free video series there that you can just go onto the site and get access to by just popping your email in. So that's the thing that I'm kind of trying to push out to people at the moment. Hopefully, as many people as possible can find it useful.
Amazing, Joe. Over to you for the closing thoughts.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this, and overall, on a personal note, and it's kind of like off sketch, but if anyone is struggling with their business, if anyone wants more clarity on their business, I would honestly massively recommend Andrew. And he doesn't know that I'm saying this, but I think what he's done for me, how he's helped me with my own business and kind of the perspectives that I gain, a lot of the entrepreneurs, a lot of the business owners who I know are in and around my age. And I think having someone who has got to the levels I might be aspiring to get to there, having him in your corner will be a massive asset. So if anyone does want to reach out to Andrew, he's quite big on LinkedIn, Andrew Webber, you can find him there. I would massively recommend him, have a conversation with him, connect with him. He's been excellent. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
So, Erald, first guest podcast in the books. What did you think of Andrew's perspectives? I mean, he's someone a little bit different to who we'd normally talk to, just given his kind of experience and what he's gone through with his business. And I think, especially for our audience, a lot of the people who will be listening are people who are probably aspiring to get to that level. So for someone who's got to, say, the £1 million level and actually thought about it and said, you know what, this doesn't work for me, how does that kind of connect with you? Because I know we've spoken about that experience before.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think for me, because we both we're on the road that Andrew has already been on. And I think having that perspective is so interesting, especially because everyone aiming for that 7-figure or 8-figure number doesn't actually know what it's like to be there. They just want to get there for whatever reason. And hearing him say that it was, mired by stress and a lot of other aspects to the business that really made it not worth running, some of the lessons that he brought forward around what he would do differently, especially, I think for me, were very kind of like sobering in a way, because it was like, okay, if I get to £1 million, then I've got 20 people and all these clients to service. If I don't have the processes in place and I don't have all this stuff, then I might also be like, this is way too stressful. And I've definitely been at points in my own agency journey, not even being close to that, only hitting sort of like early 6 figures, where I'm kind of like, oh, this is really stressful. A lot of clients, a lot of overheads to take care of here, and it's not easy. Yeah, I don't know if you also felt that listening to Andrew's sort of story.
I think as time goes on, you realize what are the check marks you want to be looking for, and there's always a base level of ideally what we'd like to get to. And for me, I remember having a moment where I checked our statement the month after it came in. We made something like 21 grand, and I had
Mm.
17k worth of expenses. And I thought, wow, there's 4k to play with here. Is this worth it? And sometimes you have those kind of epiphany moments. You ask yourself those questions, and I think it's good because what we want this podcast to be is having real raw people like Andrew. And what I'm tired of seeing, and this was a big motivation for us personally, is seeing a lot of people online who produce podcasts who essentially just exaggerate how well they're doing. And yeah,
Mm.
look, there are people out there doing exceptionally well, but we're here to talk about the things that we're grappling with as entrepreneurs, as business owners, the things that might be keeping us up at night, the challenges we're facing. And I think it's
Yeah.
great to have someone like Andrew who's essentially he's gone through no man's land, he's come out the other side and said, actually, that part in the middle, it wasn't worth it for me. And who knows? And I really hope and I'm sure he's going to build something so good with Foundernomics that it will be a business built around him. And I really think
Mm.
because a lot of the people who I speak to have these enormous aspirations, but in all honesty, they're not willing to pay the price, the cost in order to get there. And I think speaking to people like Andrew give us the perspective on actually this is how it was for me. And that's why I think he's so good for founders out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people should also consider that, a business that you're building for yourself looks very different to what a big business generally is, right? A big agency, right? If we look at Ogilvy or MC Saatchi, so I mean, some of these big agencies are actually named after some of the founders, and the businesses were initially built by them for them. But if it's a KFC or McDonald's, maybe those are probably bad examples. If it's a car brand or something, I don't know who built Audi, for example, but that type of business goal, building that kind of a business is very different to building a business that actually works for you, right? And it's unimaginable how much stress and work the people that started those businesses had to go through to get there, and eventually it may have stopped working for them at some point, or it may have continued to work really well. But if you're really building a business for yourself, and I think that's why I think everyone should follow Andrew and his Foundernomics and Solonomics sort of products. Looking at a business that doesn't work for you and working on it will, in the long run, really hurt. But building a business for you, making sure that you eat first, is, I think, the best way to ensure that you've got like a good balance of like being happy and everything else.
I want to add to that, and this was mentioned by Peter Thiel, who was one of the co-founders of PayPal, and he wrote 0 to 1. But he mentioned if the foundations of your business are flawed, then eventually your business will break. And I think an inherent problem, and this is what I experienced years ago, and I talk about this within the Bespoke Academy whenever we're teaching agency owners. However, when I first built Bespoke Brand Developers, fundamentally the business was flawed. And I think you mentioned the McDonald's, KFC, Audi, BMW, whoever you name it, they have common traits in line. Their business is massively process driven. You can find an Audi in Japan, you can find one in America, you can find one in the UK, and they will all look the same. They will all have pretty much the same regulatory mechanics. And I think if you're building a business which is so bespoke, so cut up shop, then it's going to be so hard to scale it because A, you're relying massively on talent, B, there's no processes in place, and C, you're essentially making things up as you go all the time to please people that you don't run a business. And whether you're running a small business or you're running and looking to run an enormous business, I think if you have the foundations in place from the get-go, that will astronomically improve how that looks in the end. And I think having a rough vision as to what you want it to look like within, say, 5 to 10 years, and I'm sure the vision you have for 5 to 10 years' time, unless you've already got investment secured and you're starting from level 5 out of 50, it will look very different from most people who are starting a business from scratch with a basement idea, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very tough as well. I think if you're trying to replicate big businesses, especially if you're in the agency space. So, we're speaking directly to like agency owners like us. I've worked at big agencies. Now, if you go to a Gilvey or some of these big agencies, what you'll find is that they've got set day rates for all their disciplines, usually. They have time tracking for all their clients to make sure that time is not being spent, frivolously, to ensure that each client is profitable. And that's the reason why they make tons of money, right? If you're a bespoke agency, and let's say you charge a client 2K as a small agency, and you charge two different clients 2K each, but one client is taking up 1.8K worth of resource and time, and one of them is actually taking up £400 worth of time. Well, there's obviously a discrepancy here in the model, right? You can't scale that because you don't know if you're scaling 1.8K resource, costing clients, or if you're scaling for really cost efficient clients. So I think that's bang on, Joe. And I think
Awesome.
a lot of the listeners should take that with really strong pictures. Well, really strong heed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think also I love the thought process of not all industries are built the same, and equally, not all clients are built the same. So you might have one client that's costing you £1,800, and yeah, that fundamentally isn't worth the risk. And then you might have one that costs you 400, and then you look at the middle ground of what they combined cost you, and you might find a sweet spot. You might find that because that client is super simple, that they're great. That's you're spending £400 worth of resource, but you might find a sweet spot might be between £500 to £700, and that makes sense for you based on your margins. And ultimately, there might be other avenues that go there. But look, that's on the agency side of things. There are so many other business owners who we've got coming up who are in different realms, from e-com back to agencies over to. We've got a few guys who've been in the fintech space, the payment cards and mobile space. So guys, we are really excited about what we have coming up. We're trying to bring you the best guests we can find, people from all walks of life who have been up and down, who are on their trajectory, who are looking at new avenues. And with this podcast, we want to be as transparent and raw as possible. You will not see high-end production here. We want to come to you, give you as much content as possible, the best content we can find, the best people we can find, and essentially make this authentic and raw for you guys.
Absolutely. Well put, Joe. And, we thank you all for tuning in. As we progress, the podcasts are going to get better, the guests are going to get better, but we're always going to kind of hinge on that foundation point of just being completely transparent, raw. This is how it is. This is how we're getting through it. This is how we're growing. Join us on our journey, and hopefully you'll learn something from us and the people we speak to along the way.
Yes, guys. Erald, best way for everyone to find us?
Hit us up on our socials. So it's Grappling Growth across all the, Twitter or X, if you're listening after the rebrand. We're on Instagram. Hit us up on our email, info@grapplinggrowth.com.
Instagram's grappling.growth, by the way.
Yeah, you should find us by searching that, but grappling.growth is the actual handle. And yeah, send in any questions, any feedback as well. Hate, abuse, please direct it our way. We're happy to take all feedback, good and bad. And we look forward to, hopefully seeing you again in the next episode.
Thank you, guys. Love you all and appreciate all the listeners and watchers.
Cheers.